So next we're going to talk about another classic area of social psychology, which is about helping behavior and the decisions we make about whether we will help someone or not, as well as compliance. Now, helping behavior actually relates a lot to what we talked about in the first video about how social influence can sometimes have an impact on our behavior. And a classic example of this was there was a terrible murder in the 1970s in Queens. Kitty Genovese was a young woman who was brutally murdered outside of her apartment late one evening. And the murderer actually attacked her and then came back an hour later to finish the job. And there were a few people in her apartment building who heard the attack. It was very loud. She screamed a lot. And there was a newspaper story that was published about the sheer number of people who heard something and didn't call the police in time. Now, since then, there have been articles exploring this particular story in more detail, and the number of people who actually knew that she was being attacked and it wasn't just some spat is actually fairly small. Many people heard something, but they didn't necessarily realize it was a danger. But nevertheless, it sparked an idea in some social psychologists who read this newspaper article about the number of bystanders who didn't call the police. And were curious about exploring this in a psychological context. So they were exploring what's known as the bystander effect. Some of you wrote a paper on this particular effect, but let's go ahead and talk about it in a little bit more detail. So the bystander effect is actually a fairly counterintuitive premise that other people's presence can actually impede helping at times, depending on the circumstances. And if you're surrounded by people, sometimes it actually decreases the likelihood of helping behavior occurring. There are a few different reasons why this particular phenomenon occurs. And some of you, when you were writing your paper, might have discovered exceptions to the bystander effect. So for example, when we are aware that the danger is severe or the problem is serious, the bystander effect doesn't necessarily happen every time. But there are a lot of different cases of people standing by while someone needs help and not offering assistance. And once again, this is counterintuitive, but sometimes other people around us can actually impede our capacity to realize that someone is in need of help. So Darley, Latané, and Roldan actually studied the bystander effect in a follow-up experiment where they had participants walk down a hallway and pass by someone on a ladder changing light bulbs in a classroom, and then go into a neighboring classroom and fill out some paperwork. And they were either in that classroom by themselves or they were in there with a stranger. And then they heard a crashing sound from next door. And the premise was very simple. They wanted to see whether people would get up out of their chair and check on the person in the room next door. And what they found is that when people were alone, about 70% of them would get up to check and see if the person needed help. But when they were with a stranger, only about 20% offered help. The presence of that other person actually impeded their capacity to provide and offer help. So rather than twice the help, there was actually 50% less help being provided. We not only see this when we see helping behavior, we also see this when it comes to self-preservation behavior. So the study that made me a social psychologist, the study that made me sit up and go, oh, that's really weird and fascinating, is a very classic study known as the smoke-filled room. And with the smoke-filled room, what they did was they sat people in a room to fill out paperwork, and in half of the conditions they were by themselves, and then the other half they were in a group of other people who were trained to not respond to the smoke. And what they were looking for was they piped visible smoke into the room from the corner, billowing clouds of smoke, and they wanted to see how long it would take the person to report that there was smoke in the room. And you can see that when they were by themselves, about 70% reported smoke within 3 minutes, and when they were in groups of 3, only about 30 to 40% reported it within 6 minutes. And so this even applies to self-preservation behavior, not only helping other people. I've actually got a clip of the smoke-filled room. It's not the original version of the study, but it's a study replication. And the video is without sound, but you can get the basic notion of the study by looking at it. It's a fascinating example of how the presence of others can really sometimes hamper our natural self-preservation instincts, let alone our tendency to want to help other people. Now, what's going on here is what's known as diffusion of responsibility. The presence of other people can diffuse our sense of personal responsibility to help someone out. There's also other more complicated factors at work. Basically, if we see a bunch of other people who are doing nothing, we get the sense that that's not a real thing that requires our assistance, and also that in order to fit in, we must not do anything ourselves. So sometimes normative social influence cues end up at work here, impeding our capacity to help and to break out of that influence bubble. There are other potential factors at work when it comes to whether someone will receive help. So, for example, the closer you are to a victim in terms of physical proximity, the more likely you are to feel responsible. So if someone were to, for example, have a seizure in the table right next to yours, it would be much harder for you to claim that you weren't responsible for making sure they were okay. If you perceive that it is serious, you're more likely to provide help. So, for example, they did a version of the study, the latter study, where the person fell over and there was a loud crashing sound, and there was either a cry of pain afterwards or silence. And what they found is that when the person cried out, that helping behavior went back up again, indicating that people were able to gauge that it was indeed serious and were therefore more likely to help. Once again, there's various levels of personal responsibility. So sometimes individuals can feel more personally responsible, especially if they have training in first aid, if they're a first responder, a doctor, a nurse, an EMT. Also, education is key. Social psychologists often feel a higher responsibility because they are aware of the bystander effect. So my favorite story about this is there was an enormous conference that was taking place, and there was a conference hall that had a temporary wall between that closed off a big room into two smaller rooms. And there was a conference talk going on in one of the rooms, and next door they were setting up for the next conference. So there were a bunch of social psychologists in half of this conference hall, and they heard a crashing sound next door, and all of them got up out of their chairs to go and check on who was next door to see if they were okay, because they'd all read the latter study and they didn't want to fall prey to the bystander effect. So knowledge can sometimes help with this too. Ability is another factor. So for example, first responders are not only trained to feel more responsible for taking action in cases of an emergency, but they have a higher ability. They're trained to provide first aid, they're trained to provide CPR, they know what to do, and so that increases their likelihood of taking charge. This is a fascinating one. If you find helping to be inconvenient, you're a lot less likely to step up. They did a really interesting helping behavior study in a seminary where they had seminary students give a lecture across campus, and they either gave them 5 minutes to get across campus to give this surprise lecture, or they gave them 15 minutes to get across campus to give this surprise lecture. They were also told either to give a lecture on being a seminary student or a lecture on the Good Samaritan. And then as they were walking across campus, they walked right past someone who had collapsed on the sidewalk. And what the research ended up finding is that the students' topic of their talk didn't matter, that the amount of time that they had to get across campus was the thing that was the most predictive of whether they would help. If they only had 5 minutes, they were a lot less likely to help than if they had 15. In fact, some people in the 5-minute condition walked right over the guy and didn't even see him. So convenience can be a factor when it comes to helping behavior too. Ease of escape is another thing that we can often see. So for example, if you have a medical emergency in an elevator or in a subway car, you're a lot more likely to receive help than if you're on a subway platform where people can come and go very easily and not have to look at your suffering. Personal cost is another factor. Of course, people weigh their own safety when they decide whether or not they're going to help. Kinship is another factor. Do you feel a sense of belongingness with the other person? Do you see yourself as being similar to the other person? Are you actually related to them, and how closely are you related? These are all potential factors that can determine helping behavior. So one of the things that people who are trained in providing first aid are trained in doing, for example, is to rally others to help them out. And one of the things that these first responders are trained to do is to identify people immediately, get their names, and refer to them by name often, and give them a very specific task to do. And by doing this, the person in question is made to feel personally responsible and is giving something that they're able to do. So people are a lot more likely to help when you single them out and when you give them a specific task and when you call them by name a lot so that they can't claim a lack of personal responsibility and fade into the group. Another key thing is to just make people aware that it is indeed serious. So if you yourself are ever in need of help, make a fuss so that everyone around you knows that you are in need of their assistance. And hopefully that will increase the likelihood that you will receive help. So the other topic of this video is switching from conformity and helping behavior to a topic about compliance. So whereas conformity is about changing our behavior due to social pressure, compliance is a little bit different. Compliance is changing behavior as a result of other people directing or asking for the change. So this is a lot more overt, whereas conformity behavior is an unspoken social cue. Compliance is often a direct request. And an easy way to think about compliance is it's, would you do this for me? And that could be, would you buy this product, or would you engage in this behavior, or would you recycle more? Would you vote more? So something like changing your behavior as a result of an ask from someone else. There are many different cues that result in an increase in compliance. One of these cues is one that you might have observed yourself during the recent pandemic, and that's the cue of scarcity. So scarcity means that when you believe that there's a very little of something left, that often increases your likelihood of purchasing it due to a combination of things, both in terms of perceived prestige. If there's only a limited number, you want to own that thing a little bit more. And also, once again, our scarcity brain can make us feel as if we don't buy it now, we won't ever get the chance. And so we're under greater pressure to purchase a product when we think there's only a limited number of it. Reciprocity is a compliance phenomenon where if someone does us a favor, we're more inclined to do them a favor in turn. And this can take a variety of forms. So for example, your parents every now and then might get a letter that includes their address and stickers that they give for free, and then they'll say, will you donate to this charity? Sometimes people might give a check for like 20 cents and ask people to fill out a survey. So giving people a small favor makes them more likely to want to return that favor because we don't like feeling indebted. There used to be the Hare Krishnas back in the 60s and 70s were a religious organization that would pass out flowers at airports and then request donations. And this was a classic example of reciprocity. Authority. When an authority figure tells you to purchase a product, you're more likely to believe them. So whenever someone is selling a product and they're wearing a lab coat, or it says 4 out of 5 dentists agree that this toothpaste is the way to go, that's invoking authority. Commitment and consistency is when we initially agree to purchase something and then we maintain that particular drive regardless of if the conditions change. So if the price suddenly increases or if it's a lower quality product than we initially thought, because we've made that initial decision to commit to a product, oftentimes we will follow through with it even if we end up with a worse deal. Social proof is the phenomenon where we tend to want to fit in and do what other people are doing. So if you see a particular trend where a lot of people are wearing similar kinds of clothing, that's all about social proof. We feel a greater pressure to do things because other people are also doing them, and we want to fit in and feel like we belong. And the last principle of compliance is liking, where we're more likely to purchase a product if we like the person who's selling it. Oftentimes, when you see a spokesperson, for example, for insurance, all those spokespeople, the Gecko, Flo from Progressive, the State Farm guy, the Havoc, the guy from that one insurance company, I don't even remember, but he pretends to be like a raccoon or a teenage girl, and he's funny. All of those are intended to invoke liking. Now, these 6 principles of compliance were discovered by Bob Cialdini, who's my favorite social psychologist. He went around studying the behavior of used car salesmen and door-to-door salesmen in order to gain some practical knowledge about how people convince other people to buy things. And he's written some really great books about it. So here's a few things that Cialdini discovered that are specific strategies or tactics. One is the foot in the door technique, where you ask for a small commitment and then ask for a bigger commitment. So for example, people might initially say, will you sign this petition to help with this particular movement? And then if you sign it, they'll say, will you donate money to this particular movement? And people are more likely to donate after they've initially signed the petition. This is due to the commitment and consistency principle at work. This is a riskier move, but it also sometimes has bigger payoff. So the door in the face technique is where you first ask for a really big commitment and then ask for a smaller commitment that seems more reasonable. So you might say, will you put this enormous sign up in your yard? And when somebody goes, oh man, I really can't swing that, that's a bit of an eyesore, then they'll go, well, will you put this bumper sticker on your car? Or, well, will you donate money to our campaign? And that will seem a lot more reasonable. This is due to reciprocity at work. So when you say, I'm going to downgrade the degree of the favor that I'm asking you, that actually is doing that person a favor. And so they feel more obligated to respond because you're being reasonable by asking them for a smaller request. One of the challenges with this, of course, is you could just end up getting the door slammed in your face without it being opened up again. The lowball technique is where you get a commitment from a person and then you raise the cost of that commitment, but they're more likely to stick with the initial purchase because they've committed to it. This happens all the time when you purchase a car or a home. They'll keep adding on all these various costs, and it'll quickly balloon out of control. But you've signed the papers, you've agreed to this thing, and so it's very hard for you to back out. Because I'm a social psychologist, I tend to be not as impacted by this. I remember when I was purchasing my car that I currently drive, I told the salesman that I didn't want automatic locks or windows, and I didn't need cruise control. And he said, but it's so much more convenient. And I said, no, that's fine. And he said, but we're going to have to order it special and it'll take a few more days. And I said, no, that's fine. And he said, it's not in the color you wanted. And I said, oh, no, that's fine. And he said, but you're going to have to thumb your locks yourself every time. And I said, you know what? Every time I have to thumb my lock closed myself, I will think to myself, I saved myself $1,500 and it'll make me feel better. Please get me the car that I want. And lo and behold, I got the car that I wanted. But that would be an example of someone attempting to do a lowball technique, to raise the price on the car with additional packages that I didn't need or want.